Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I believe we're ready to pick up right where we left off. Ms. Hamburger, further questions for this witness?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. So, Dr. Blackshear, I think before the lunch recess, you had just told us that you had diagnosed Nate with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
And that's otherwise known as PTSD.
Right.
And you were about to explain to us how you arrived at that diagnosis for Nate based on the criteria in the DSM-5.
Well, I mean, it was a combination of all of those records that were reviewed, as well as my conversations with Nate, learning about the things that he had experienced in his history, learning about his family's structure and what level it was functioning, and also hearing and reading about the level of violence that he witnessed.
Mm-hmm. And can you take us through the criteria for PTSD in the DSM-5 and which of those criteria Nate meets?
All right. So, in order to be, sort of diagnosed with the condition, you must have experienced one of the following, and that is the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing a traumatic event, or witnessing in person the events as it occurred to others, or learning that the event occurred to a close family member or a close friend, or experiencing repeated exposure to aversive details or trauma. So that's like hearing trauma or being a responder to traumatic events. So for Nate, being in the environment where the violence was happening, and so that's witnessing it in person and watching as the violence had occurred to his mother, and even when he wasn't there, seeing the evidence that it had occurred is also traumatic, seeing her face bruised, swollen, different things like that. The presence of more than one of the following criteria, and it's intrusive memories about the traumatic event, recurrent distressing dreams, sort of dissociative reactions in which a person may, when an event occurs, they don't have the same physiological responsivity and connection to it when they sort of dissociate from it, or intend to prolong distress at the exposure to internal and external cues, or marked psychological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize aspects of the traumatic events. And so when we're looking at,
Let me just stop
and you only need one of those.
Right, so that's what I was going to ask. So you've just read a list of potential symptoms.
Right.
And
the criteria, yeah. Not so much symptom. Yeah.
But the patient needs only to meet have one of those.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And which of those, one or more, did you find regarding Nate?
Number one, I think when thinking about the exposure to the prolonged exposure, sort of the reactivity that he had, especially when you had when he was robbed and beaten, his reaction to those things through crying. I mean, he didn't sort of respond to those things in a visceral, violent reaction to them. It was more so it's one or two ways people respond to traumatic events like that. Sometimes they can be really anger expressive, and other times they'll be sort of internal and anger suppressive. And Nate was much more of an anger suppressive type.
I think one of the things you named on that list was dissociative responses.
Yeah.
Does that apply to Nate?
When talking to Nate about the actual date of the incident, and trying to get a feel for his thinking as he was in the house shooting and watching the events take place to people that he actually cared about, that he was actually committing, and his the way that he was able to sort of recall his thinking at the time was that I'm blacked out with anger, blacked out. It wasn't sort of like he was really in tune. I I liken that he sort of recovered his true awareness when he was out in the woods and with the cops about to arrest him, than when he was sort of in the moment, And so the other part of negative alterations in cognitions and moods, so inability to remember certain aspects of the trauma. Especially children who go through repeated trauma will remember the traumatic events almost in flashes as opposed to long broken out narratives. So you don't get the explanations that you would an adult who experienced a single traumatic event. You get much more of, this happened and this happened, but not the level of detail that you would typically get. Persistent, exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself or others. Nate persistently believed that his father-in-law was a negative, had a negative orientation towards him. There was a lot of when he talked about that relationship, it was persistently from early on. This man was sort of out to get me. This man was sort of doing me and my relationship and my marriage harm. Persistent, distorted cognitions about the causes or consequences of an event, of the traumatic event that leads the individual to blame oneself or others. And, reading his statement when he talked about that his in-laws deserved what happened, to me that represents, the complete distortion of cognitions. And it was really interesting because over time, of getting to talk to him, I'm always sort of trying to work an angle where, as we're talking, to see whether or not a person is able to sort of really grapple with the gravity of what happened and the sort of the implications of it and their own responsibility in it. And it was in January, I would say, at my last time meeting with him. Well, maybe it was December, I apologize. Probably was December, where he was able to own that he had done this and that, especially that Tanya's mother didn't deserve what had happened, But that's, to me, indicative of, a lot of time to sort of process and think through things. Persistent negative emotions, state of fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame. Those things, obviously, since I've been meeting with him, are there, especially the guilt and the shame about what had occurred. I think a lot of the shame, shows up as denial and being unable to, especially early on, to own own that he had done what he had done, but also to own the impact that that's going to have on his own children, the impact it has on the life of LaTanya, impact it's going to have on his life for the rest of it. And we got closer to that. Again, this is because this is my area of expertise and I know how to work with people to get them to begin to sort of do these things. But my recommendation would be that, over time that he continue to have someone working with him in treatment. And then we get down to the marked alterations in arousal and reactivity. Irritability, anger outbursts with little to no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression to other people. Sorry, going fast. As verbal or physical aggression toward people or objects. With us, what I call a suppressed hostility, right? Suppressed hostile. These people tend to fill that container I mentioned earlier with traumatic events and life disappointments and complications and all the rest. And once that container is no longer capable of being a reserve for those things, and if they don't have a good, mechanism for release, you wind up getting behaviors that shock everybody who know these people. Suppressed hostiles aren't the hotheads who are always in trouble or always in fights or things like that. They're typically people who are not very reactive until they're reactive, and then they can be quite destructive. Reckless or self-destructive behavior. Some of that comes with, engaging in the drug use and then the alcohol use, and, being being involved with the, petty hustling of marijuana. I mean, all of that to me is self-destructive behavior. That's not things that people who value themselves will typically do. And some of the others, and for folks who needing, you actually need 2 or more of these, and those 2 resonate with me more. Hypervigilance. When we began to sort of talk about Nate's relationship, especially with his father-in-law, the hypervigilance was that this guy was always, this guy is always out to get me. He's out to destroy my children. He's out to, especially his son. He's, and, I don't know, I wasn't there to do reality testing with that or anything, but that sort of consistently believing the worst about his father-in-law sort of was evidence of that for me. And the others are exaggerated startle response, problem with concentration, and sleep disturbance. And to diagnose someone with that, with this condition, it has to cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of a person's functioning, and the disturbance would not be due to the effects of alcohol or drugs or another mental condition. And yeah, so.
So for you, those are the criteria of PTSD, the clinical criteria that Nate meets.
Yes.
And that allows you to render a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
And some of the things that we talked about a little bit before lunch, you talked again about the container and stuffing things, stuffing negative experiences and emotions into the container.
Right.
Are you saying that that's a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder?
I'm saying yes, that a way that people who've endured, especially chronic complex stress, you will see it, in a couple of ways. I mean, most typically we think of seeing people, complaining of nightmares or night sweats, or jumping on the floor when they hear a car backfire because they were in a combat zone or things like that. But there are a lot of other ways that people deal with and display sort of having that history, especially when it's prolonged and chronic. So this wasn't an event. So you don't have kind of an event flashback as you would. This was his life, right? So you have it's a very different. So one way that especially children learn how to survive in really volatile, violent homes is to suppress their reaction, because that's how they maintain their sanity.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, I think if you watch the news or just sort of have a popular understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder, you might think flashbacks and nightmares are as being sort of a hallmarks of that disease. Does Nate suffer from symptoms like that?
Nate never complained to me about having nightmares or anything like that. When I think about flashbacks, so flashbacks are really the dissociative thing that we mentioned. So I think most people, I think the common understanding of them is that you will have something that will trigger you into imagining yourself in a space where your trauma occurred, right? But when we talk about sort of depersonalization and derealization, it really is about being sort of dissociated from the moment that you're in, right? And that's really kind of what a flashback is, and that's what a dissociative response is. And the evidence that I have that he had likely at least engaged in an episode of dissociative response would have been on the day that this actually happened.
I don't know if you've used this term, but I think it's probably one you're familiar with, the term complex trauma.
Right.
What does that mean to you?
Oh yeah, I mentioned that earlier. Complex trauma is the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress, and their researchers have been sort of promoting the idea of complex trauma being put into the DSM-6, the next version, or maybe a revised version of the DSM-5, because they want to be able to more clearly establish that during the formative years, individuals who are growing up in environments with a multitude of chronic traumas should be more easily sort of assessed as having post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah.
So the current diagnosis that's in the DSM-5, it doesn't say anything about complex trauma.
No, but I mean it's very, very much in the lexicon of the practice and in research, because it's a burgeoning sort of idea, because we understand that. So I mean, all right, so people coming back from Vietnam were thought to have combat fatigue, right? And so it wasn't until the 80s that we actually were able to sort of pull together a cluster of ideas to make it PTSD. And in the 90s, being well researched, and in the 2000s, being better able to offer the diagnoses. But as things like community violence, domestic violence, foster care and adoption violence, I mean, all of these things where children are being exposed to a myriad of traumas, we're looking at those as a complex and wanting to be better able to offer a diagnostic picture for those individuals.
Mm-hmm. So does, you said that, you said early on in your testimony that one of the things you do is you do contract work for the VA evaluating post-traumatic stress disorder cases in veterans. Is that right?
Yes.
And you said you do over 100 a year?
Yes, yeah, easily.
Or 200, I think you might have said.
I would say in a given week, I'm doing between 3 and 6.
Okay. And are those generally cases where there's one big traumatic event? Are you looking at cases of complex trauma? Is it a mix? How does that break down?
Largely, they're going to be complex, because we're talking about individuals who have been deployed in combat situations, and they've been there for, in most cases, about a year. So during that entire time, they're experiencing different things. When I get non-combat related, those are usually incidents where it may have been a bad accident, it may have been military sexual trauma, may have been the death of a partner, or it may have been some domestic abuse situation while a person was active duty. So it varies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And have you noticed that complex trauma manifests itself differently generally than trauma that's related to one traumatic event?
Well, we know what I notice is that complex trauma, multiple traumas in childhood, manifests itself differently as a person gets older. Mm-hmm. You can sort of see it even with simple but individual events, or maybe someone who's been sent to combat. When they come back, a lot of times they won't exhibit some of the trauma related symptoms until years later, especially after retirement. But children are developing, their brains are developing, their ways of managing and navigating the world is developing. They have not had the time and the experience to develop adaptive skills to be able to even respond to trauma. So it's very different when dealing with children. It's why we have an entire national center devoted to this population, because we understand that there's some restorative things that have to be done for individuals who endure trauma during their early formative years.
Mm-hmm. Nate, we've heard some testimony, and in the materials that you've reviewed, I think, we talked a little bit about how he did pretty well in school, certainly his teachers liked him. He wasn't a behavior problem. He raised a family. He worked. He was pretty functional, some would argue. Is that consistent with the PTSD diagnosis?
So one really doesn't have anything to do with the other. So he's, again, and I mentioned earlier, school was a place where adults acted like adults, where the environment was safe. So it's not surprising to me that a kid with, his natural intellectual capacity could go to school and and do well, especially if he's getting positive reinforcement. He's getting the love of the teachers. So it doesn't surprise me.
So what happens when someone with PTSD becomes psychologically distressed?
They can engage in some pretty self or toward other destructive behaviors. That's why we have, we have a lot of hotlines and things like that available to this population, because, one of the things I check with everyone when they walk in the room is, are you a risk or a threat at harming yourself or someone else? And because when a person is with this condition is psychologically distressed, they become a much higher risk for harm to self or someone else than someone who doesn't have it.
And you just mentioned hotlines. Did Nate ever receive, to your knowledge, any outside assistance or treatment?
Not that I know
regarding
of.
his trauma?
Yeah.
Are there treatments available that can help people
Oh yeah, absolutely.
with that history?
Yeah. Some of the best ones are cognitive restructuring therapy, especially for children, because it allows them to do a little bit of brain work to remap their brains and sort of bypass some of their trauma triggers. And dialectic behavior therapy is another that we utilize because it helps with affect regulation. And because people with PTSD typically do not regulate their affect and emotions very well, and that's why they become potentially harmful people to themselves or others.
So we talked a lot about traumas Nate experienced growing up. And at some point, I'm sure you're aware, he met LaTanya Taylor and started a relationship with her. So let's talk a little bit about that. But first, growing up, what was modeled for Nate about male-female relationships?
Well, yeah, I think I mentioned this earlier. It's just that when what Nate learned about how adults engage in relationships from his family of origin is almost like an addictive type of love, where here are two people together. It's a very harmful, violent relationship, but they're not obviously leaving the relationship. They maintained it for quite a long time. So Nate did not have a good primary model of how to have how to have a relationship with someone you love, how adults have relationships. He was modeled dysfunction.
Mm-hmm. How did he respond to that modeling as he grew up and became an adolescent and started his own romantic relationships?
I think that because LaTanya's family was an intact family that did not appear to have the same levels of dysfunction. I mean, I think that would have been for him, it would have been an opportunity to attach himself to a family where he could have maybe had a different type of life than the one he had grown up in, and provided a different one for his own children. But without the corrective work, right? Without the work that goes in and helps to undo the harm that history is called, it's still very hard to do, because even in a good, intact family, you're still going to have to deal with loss. You're still going to have to deal with anger. You can still have to deal with hurt. And when you haven't done that work, it becomes very difficult, especially as the stakes get higher, to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. So how did Nate handle problems in this relationship?
Now, based on my conversations with him, he was basically very similar to how he dealt with his family of origin. He would sort of downplay it, make it seem like it wasn't as significant as it was, even up to the point where it appeared that his marriage was dissolving. He still sort of held out hope that the marriage was going to somehow get restored, that the relationship, despite all indicators that was terminating, that there was somehow something or some way this was going to get restored. And again, you're doing that coming from a place where you've not been adequately modeled on how you restore a relationship. How do you break up even, right? And so when his family broke up, his mother wound up, degenerating further, so.
And what did parenthood mean to Nate?
From our conversations, parenthood was, and I smile when you ask that, because he really, really expressed a lot of value in being a parent. And being a parent is a complex job in and of itself. And I think he tried to do what he thought was a good father would do, and tried to create a model for himself out of that. So being a model, as opposed to having witnessed one, provide a lot of good care. And he tried with what he had, and but did not. Still, there was no real corrective things to help sort of undo that history, so that he could actually be a good, functioning father and partner to LaTanya.
You've heard, you're aware of an incident where Nate apparently beat Jeremy, his son, with a broom.
Right.
How does that fit in with what you just said about Nate's parenting?
Well, again, I'm not surprised. Nate, if I'm recalling correctly, Jeremy was progressing to adolescence at the time that happened. And, I've worked with parents who have not gone through this, have not gone through what Nate gone through, and they have these, awful reactions to how to discipline their children as they move into adolescence, where I'm having to say, hey, you have to stop hitting the kid. So I'm not surprised, but again, if your model was when frustration presents itself, in the way that you are in control of your children, much less, much different than you are maybe in your relation to your spouse, providing physical discipline was, the way that he thought that moment, called for that sort of thing. And, so.
So you're aware, of course, that at some point LaTanya decided to leave the marriage.
Mm-hmm.
What was Nate's reaction to Tanya's decision to leave?
When we walked through that whole period, it appeared to me that Nate had thought that somehow, some way, that their relationship would prevail. And, when reading through the text logs, seeing Nate would communicate with her, flirtatiously, in a way that seemed kind of like quasi-seductive, trying to maintain a connection. Her responses were clear that she was, boundaried against those sort of responses, and or those sort of advances. And I think, when Nate, wrote her shortly before the incident about their kid's birthday party, and wanting her to be there, and saying that all of his family was expecting her to show up. Again, that's all to me saying that, you had not really registered that this is done, right? So, many of us who've gone through divorce, as painful as that is, you understand that now there are going to be two parties for the kid's birthday. It won't be one where everybody come together, most likely, especially given the state of their split at the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, so there's a process of acceptance.
Yeah.
And are you saying Nate wasn't very far along yet in that process of acceptance?
No, in my understanding of where Nate was with regards to acceptance was that it probably, I got the sense that acceptance happened at the start of this trial.
Mm-hmm. And why did it happen at the beginning of the trial?
Well, I'm going to sustain it. I'll hear a proffer on it, but I'll need to find out what he's going to say before I allow it in.
I could probably lay a quick foundation, possibly. You,
All right, members of the jury, I'm going to ask you to step in the deliberation room for a moment. If you'd leave your notepads on the chairs, please don't discuss the matter among yourselves. Yes, ma'am. Where are you going with this?
well, just for argument, or you'd like me to?
Well, I mean, just a forecast of the evidence would be fine. We can do a voir dire if we need to, but
I mean, it's really no more than that particular question. So, Dr. Blacksher has seen Mr. Holden since the trial began. He saw him in mid-January, was the last meeting that they had together. And he's saying that he's going to say that it was at that point was the first time that he heard from Nate a statement of acceptance that the relationship was actually over. And part of what we're talking about here is one of the psychological phenomenon result of his childhood, result of trauma, is that at the time that the crime occurred, and certainly prior to the crime occurring, from the time that Tanya left, that Nate had a very difficult time accepting that the relationship was actually over, and that's part of what his psychological state was.
Okay, the question you asked is why did this happen at the beginning of the trial?
And the answer that he's going to give is that the first time Nate saw LaTanya with her new husband, that's what it took in order for him to understand that the relationship was over.
What's the state have to say about that?
I mean, Your Honor, I think this is sort of beyond mitigation, and we would object to it coming in. I don't see the purpose for it. Maybe that he's accepting responsibility, and I'm uncomfortable with that. Again, I don't see any reasonable purpose for that to be a part of his opinion or part of his testimony.
Has he met with him since?
Yes.
My understanding the last meeting was in December.
January 2017.
Oh, I thought he corrected that date to December, but maybe.
No, it was mid January.
All right, mid-January. So after this trial had begun. My concern was it was going to get into the plea negotiations, and my concern continues to be whether it opens the door for the state to go down that path in cross-examination. But I will leave it at that, and then if the state wishes to go down into alternative theories as to why the defendant may have chosen to accept responsibility on the eve of trial, then I'll leave that for the state to decide. But
I think maybe my question has not been clear enough is what I'm getting from hearing both of the responses, because I'm not talking about acceptance of responsibility. I'm talking about acceptance of the only behavior. And maybe I'm using the word in a way that could be interpreted ambiguously. But what I'm asking is whether he actually is willing to accept that the marriage was over.
all right. I would ask it very carefully, and I would answer it very carefully, and because I really don't want to confront the question of whether plea negotiations somehow become relevant to the process of in this phase of the trial. So I'll just urge you to make sure your question is clear. All right, very well. Let's,
Can I ask the court to cover something?
Yes. All right.
Reminds what you asked questions.
Yeah. This is the colloquy that I was concerned about, and I'll just read it because I have it here in front of me. So there's a process of acceptance, question mark. And are you saying Nate wasn't very far along in that acceptance, in that process of acceptance? Answer: no, in my understanding of where Nate was with regard to acceptance was probably, I got the sense that acceptance was at the start of this trial. And why did it happen at the beginning of the objection? And why did it happen at the beginning of the, so if you're talking about acceptance of the end of his marriage, I think that you should limit it to that. But this overall notion of acceptance in a general sense, I think is the danger. Well, it may not have been in context, but I think we just need to be careful about the whole notion of acceptance of responsibility. If that's what you're asking about, fine. But if you're asking about acceptance of the termination of his marriage, let's just be precise in the question. All right, let's go ahead and bring jurors back out, please. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so I'm going to sustain the objection on the basis of form, but allow you to re-ask the question.
So Dr. Blackshear, we were talking about Nate's reaction to Tanya's decision to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe you had said that he didn't feel that the relationship was really over. Is that
Yes.
right? When did Nate actually accept or begin to accept that this relationship was actually over?
Nate had referred to LaTanya as his wife for almost the entire time that I had met with him, and it wasn't until actually he had seen her and her new husband that he actually started referring to her as by her name instead of my wife.
Okay. And he saw them together when this trial began, is that right?
Yes.
Here in the courtroom. Have you had an opportunity to review a letter that Nate sent to the clerk of court here in Wake County
Yes.
at the time of his divorce?
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of that letter?
The letter is pretty consistent with what his thinking at the time of that he and LaTanya had a enduring commitment to marriage.
And so that is that in keeping with what you said before, that he wasn't recognizing that the relationship was really over?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And is that feeling of his that the relationship could be salvaged, is that related to the trauma and the PTSD?
It's related to, I think, the distorted cognitions that even an event like this, that the marriage could endure, that she would somehow come to his aid and rescue. I mean, I think all of that's clear, cognitive distortion.
Okay, and the cognitive distortions, that's one of the symptoms of
Mm-hmm.
PTSD that Nate exhibits, right?
Yeah.
Was this separation from LaTanya, would you classify that as a traumatic event for Nate?
Loss is any type of loss, whether it's divorce or death. I mean, those are some pretty heavy, painful events, and those are traumas for the couple as well as for the children who are involved.
Mm-hmm. And was Nate's response to that sort of loss different because of his trauma history?
Well, yes. I mean, for it to have resulted in the incident as it did, yeah, that his trauma history was clearly I think the X factor that made him, susceptible to an event that would cause harm to the people that he had, that he cared for.
So given how big a deal the separation was to Nate, did Nate have adequate support to get through it, do you think?
I think one of the things that was indicated was that advice to him was to find another woman.
And who did he get that advice from?
His father. And but did he go through counseling? Did he have even perhaps someone who could impart wisdom on how to cope with feelings and all of that, and when going through that, maybe even doing some restorative work with regards to now he's beginning to really agitate and feel those emotions as he's losing his link to normalcy as he would have had. No, he didn't have that.
Mm-hmm. He had the support of his father, I think you mentioned. Was that problematic in any way?
I mean, that's what he had, but it wasn't going to be the type of support that would have been needed for somebody with his history of trauma to be able to cope with this event of splitting his family well.
You've heard, I'm sure, about the an incident where Nate's son, Jeremy, JT, accused his grandfather, Sylvester Taylor, of slapping him and possibly having a gun or pulling a gun on him.
Mm-hmm.
Why was this a significant event for Nate?
Oh, because his child being threatened with harm. I mean, it would be, for anyone, his kid is threatened with bodily harm by someone, that's a huge event. So it was definitely big for him, like it would be. Yeah.
And was it particularly important for him, given his trauma history?
I would say that I don't know a parent where that would not be a significant event, it becomes more problematic because of his history, and it leaves for, possible more volatile outcome because of his history. But would there be a parent who, if it was reported by a child that someone slapped me or pulled a gun on me, who would not have a protective, very upset reaction? I doubt it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You're familiar with what happened on April 9th, 2014, right?
Yes.
And you said earlier that one of the consequences of the trauma Nate experienced in his life is that he had a pattern of suppressing emotions,
Mm-hmm.
especially negative emotions, right?
Correct.
Do you think that played a role on April 9th?
I think that, this was all probably, part of a course of events that started with the beginning of the unraveling of the marriage, and, culminated into the explosive outcome on the 9th. Yeah.
And how is PTSD relevant to that?
It leaves, someone like Nate, especially a suppressed hostile, when they have reached their capacities to suppress affect and emotion, that is probably going to come out in some way or another. And I think it left him, without any reserves for coping. And he, became, he reacted violently against his family.
And you, I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you're aware that Nate made a statement to a social worker, Lorna Haddix, just a couple of days after the crime. How does that statement fit in with your understanding of what happened?
Those cognitive distortions, they deserved it. I mean, when you and as time has gone on, and those you're able to, and because I am able to ask questions that sort of get around cognitive distortions and ask them in a way that they're not threatening, and the person doesn't, feel like they're losing face by being able to talk to me beyond those distortions, and also, doing some of the things in our talks together that with that rapport over time, that got really removed out of his language to me about whether or not whether or not his family members, LaTonya's parents and LaTonya, deserved what he had done. But in the throes of his irrationality, his anger, his hurt, and all of that, those cognitive distortions are just on front. They're on full display. That's why you get that letter talking about, how LaTonya and I have made this, we made our vows before God, and there's nothing that's enduring, and that shouldn't, the fact that, I shot her parents and killed them, and, shot her, and none of that should impact the marriage, right? That's cognitive distortion.
Mm-hmm. And you're aware that Nate fired his gun in the vicinity of some law enforcement officers in the hours after the crime. Is that right?
Yes.
How does that fit into your understanding of what happened that night?
When he and I talked about it, my assumption is that he was probably attempting suicide by police.
And why would he have wanted to commit suicide at that point?
Because of what he had done, and the pain and horror of what he had done. And he's also, when you kill somebody, and when you hurt people, unless you're, maybe a serial killer or something like that, most people, and I've worked with a lot of people who've done it, but they experience that. That's a trauma that they experience. And so, here he was committing trauma while he was experiencing trauma from the trauma he committed, right? And again, I mentioned before, when people with PTSD run out of coping mechanisms available, coping capacity, they become really dangerous to themselves and others. And he'd been dangerous to others, and this was an attempt to be dangerous to himself.
So, on April 9th, 2014, was Nate experiencing, in your opinion, a mental or emotional disturbance?
In the sense that he was psychologically distressed about the dissolution of his marriage, yes, of course.
Mm-hmm. And was his ability to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law impaired?
Overruled.
From his explanation of how out of control he felt during the events when he was shooting his in-laws and shooting and beating his wife, he didn't have, in my opinion, the capacity to restrain at that point in time.
Thank you. And before I finish, Your Honor, I do want to move to put, move those three items into evidence that are there in front of Dr. Blackshear.
That would be 13, 14, 15?
That's correct.
All right, 13's already been admitted. 14, any objection to 14 or 15?
No, Your Honor.
All right, they are allowed. Is that correct? Let's take a break and then resume with cross-examination of this witness. So we'll break until 4:45. Members of the jury, please recall all the instructions, leave your notepads in the chair, and return to the deliberation room at 3:45.